The New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society presents this recording from March 25, 2025. Sarah Relyea hosted a wide-ranging conversation on historical fiction with Leslie Wells, Jane Rosenman, and Judy Sternlight. These three veteran editors from 5E, an independent editors collective, have worked on several successful historical novels. They discuss trends in the market, how to maintain personal momentum while writing, the process of working with a developmental editor, and much more. Information about our chapter is available at our website at hnsnyc.org. The link listed in the description, along with our participants and their links. Thank you, and enjoy the program.
Welcome to the Historical Novel Society's New York City chapter. Today, we're delighted to be in discussion with Judy Sternlight, Jane Rosenman, and Leslie Wells of 5E Editors, an independent editors collective. I'm Sarah Relyea in Brooklyn, New York. Thanks to author Faith Justice for setting up the Zoom and monitoring the chat. Okay, today's speakers are all members of 5E, a small collective of independent book editors with backgrounds at major publishing houses. Founded 12 years ago, they work with clients independently, but come together for workshops, panels, and brainstorming sessions. They have deep ties in the literary community, and they love helping writers, agents, and publishers get their best work out there. Okay, I'll begin with brief introductions and a presentation from each speaker. After that, I'll have some questions for the panel, and then we'll open it up to audience Q&A. Our first speaker, Judy Sternlight, was an editor at Random House, Ballantine, and Modern Library before founding Judy Sternlight Literary Services. Prior to her publishing career, she performed and taught improvisational theater with some assembly required in New York City. She has taught and mentored creative writers at the Center for Fiction and other New York City arts organizations, drawing on theatrical and literary techniques. She's worked with many acclaimed authors, including Elliot Ackerman, Marie-Helene Bertino, Rita Mae Brown, Mamta Chaudhry, Gwen Florio, Brett Anthony Johnston, Lisa Coe, Peter Matheson, Daniel Menaker, Melody Winauer, and David Roblewski. That's a fantastic list. For more information, you can see her website, www.judysternlightlit.com. I'll put that into the comment section later. Okay, today Judy will be talking about some key challenges that historical novelists must overcome in order to bring their novels to the finish line. Welcome, Judy. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. You know, when I first started working with historical novelists, something that struck me was, oh my God, it can take so long to research and write a historical novel. You guys have a really long time span. So I just wanted to spend a few minutes talking today about some ways to fortify your stamina and hang in there, which I've gleaned from different writers, fellow editors, agents. So the first thing I wanted to say is in Poets and Writers this month, there's a really good piece about Karen Russell, who has a new novel out called The Antidote. And it caught my attention because I noticed that it took her about 15 years to start from the kernel of the idea to actually publishing it with Knopf. So she was in the middle of writing Swamplandia back in 2009 when an image landed in her head of a woman holding an emerald green horn to her ear, collecting people's memories. And her driving question was this: there are things so painful to remember, these chapters of our very private history, that if you could just tear them out and hand them to someone else, even temporarily, wouldn't you do it? So she took a lot of time to research the American Dust Bowl in the 1930s, and it's set in Nebraska, the relationship between white settlers and the land and the Pawnee Nation. And during those 15 years, she would occasionally set it aside for a while, and she would develop her short stories. She published a novella and a theatrical piece. Anyway, it's a good piece if you feel like you need a little inspiration to justify, why it's really taking a long time to fully properly get through all the stages of working on your book. I did not work with Karen Russell, but as Sarah mentioned, I worked with Peter Matheson on Shadow Country, David Wroblewski on Familiaris, Melody Winnower on The Scribe of Siena, and Mamta Chowdhury on Haunting Paris. And all four of them took a long time to do the narrative arc of getting to the finish line. So, how does a historical novelist find the stamina to keep going? I came up with 7 ideas I'm going to share with you, some of which may be obvious, but some of which are probably good reminders. Number 1 is build a support system. And this idea comes from Molly Moylan Brown, who is one of my favorite writing coaches. Being a part of a community like the Historical Novel Society is great. And so is joining a writing group, taking a workshop class, finding another writer that you feel like is sort of a kindred spirit and trading, manuscripts. You can also ask your friends and family to cheer you on, even if you're not letting them see your book yet. You can just make sure you've got a circle around you of people who are supporting what is, an ambitious task. The second thing is bringing in an independent editor. Of course, all the 5e editors think this is a great idea. It's really productive and it can often pop your book to the next level, but you have to be strategic about when and how often to do it. It's a financial investment, it's a creative investment. I've occasionally come in really early on consultations. Like when I worked with Lisa Coe, she had about 100 pages of the levers and she was wrestling with some story questions about where to take the story and what to focus on. So I came in very early. But I will say that more often I come in later in the process, usually, um, when an agent has sent the book out to a few places and it's come back because there are some really good things about the book, but something about it is not right yet. Um, one of my jobs when I'm working with a writer is to confer with them and figure out when should I be brought in, because I probably have 2 good full reads in me. And sometimes I'll look at bits and pieces after that, whether it's a new outline or a couple of chapters that were really problematic. Um, but it's not an endless resource, which is why it's good to have other ways to get good feedback. The third point is fight the urge to do a quick turnaround. I was just talking to an agent about this the other day. We were laughing about it because sometimes when a writer, gets fresh feedback, they scramble to like address everything in there and like throw it back to the agent or the editor. And what happens is you miss stuff. If you do it too quickly, you don't see all the repercussions of the changes you've made, and it can just feel rushed. So my advice is to just, use that burst of enthusiasm to go in and make all those changes, but then let it marinate and look at it again before you turn it in. Okay, number 4, read books that inspire you. Um, Reading books that are good in ways that you are wrestling with can be really helpful. When you're doing it, you can analyze what do you love about what that other writer's doing? What do you hate that you're not going to do in your book? When I give editorial feedback, I often mention 1 or 2 books that might be useful to a writer, depending on what they are, working to bump up to the next level. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples that I've sometimes given. Maggie O'Farrell, who wrote Hamnet and The Marriage Portrait, is excellent at making her characters live and breathe on the page, even though they're set hundreds of years ago. And I think Lauren Groff also does this in The Matrix. Sometimes I recommend Sally Rooney because her first 2 novels are great for tight, impactful dialogue. And she's also really good at establishing a second layer, kind of bubbling under the surface, which is, I guess, what you would call subtext. And then Ken Follett in Pillars of the Earth and Emily St. John Mandel in Station 11. I think they're both especially good at narrative tension and also creating chapter endings that yank you into the next chapter. Okay, let's see. 5, seek out hits of dopamine. This is really important when you've been working on your book for several years and you feel like you're really close, and then, oh no, that's not really, I got to get back in there. So how do you seek out hits of dopamine? You can work on short pieces and then work to get them published. And if you do get them published, it gives you kind of a boost to give you more patience to, periodically return to your longer work. Sometimes the dopamine comes from getting to the next level with your historical novel, whether it's finding an agent or getting positive feedback from editors or publishers. Even if they're not quite ready to sign up the book, they're professional ideal readers, and they can sometimes give you a fresh perspective that will give you very targeted ideas of how to strengthen your book, and also just kind of more juice because you're getting closer and you're getting there. 6, liberate your mind. It's really important. I've heard writers say and write to each other, but in the chair time, stick with it. You've got to really, create a schedule for yourself and make sure you're being disciplined about really keeping your butt in the chair. But I think the opposite is true as well, which is sometimes you've just got to get outside and just sort of let your mind wander, whether it's exercise, gardening, playing with your dog or your kids. That kind of unstructured time out in nature, for example, can be so good for just loosening your thoughts and allowing your brain to make connections while you're focusing on something else. And finally, 7, know when to move on. There are 2 writers I know who I've worked with over the years. Ziva Bukai, who wrote The Anatomy of Exile, and Bina Kamlani, who wrote The English Problem. They're both out with really good debut novels. And it occurred to me, they each had an earlier novel that was well written and good and promising, but something about it, they could not get it to the finish line. And they both made the brave choice to just set the previous thing aside because they got a really good idea that inspired them. And that new idea had staying power. So I think sometimes the brave thing to do is to set your novel aside and just focus on something else for a while, let it rest, and go back later and see, is there something really good in that earlier book? Or was it a stepping stone that was simply meant to strengthen my craft and get me to this book, which is the book I am meant to work on? All right, so that's my 2 cents, and I applaud all of you for sticking with it and working on historical novels. And if you have a great idea about how to keep yourself motivated, please throw it in the chat, or maybe when we're doing Q&A, tell us, because I really like collecting these ideas. They help a lot of writers. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Judy. Our second speaker is Jane Rosenman. Prior to becoming an independent editor, Jane was an executive editor at Houghton Mifflin, Scribner, and St. Martin's Press. She was also editorial director at Washington Square Press, where she acquired Larry Watson's spectacular historical novel, Montana, 1948. Jane has edited extensively in the areas of literary fiction, memoir, and narrative nonfiction. Today, Jane will be speaking to us about research, a crucial element in crafting historical fiction. But how do you research so that the narrative feels authentic, lived in, and not drowning in facts that may not contribute to compelling fiction? Jane has some tips based on her interviews with novelists who have traversed this challenging territory. Welcome, Jane. And I'm sorry, just before Jane begins, if I could remind everyone, please mute if you're not speaking. Thank you.
Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. So yes, integrating details with research, but also keep the novel moving along. So what I really wanted to kind of hone in on is that I would say almost sort of taking a step backwards, that a historical novel is a novel. I think first and foremost. And so at one point you guys asked for, at one point you'll want to talk in general ways about other topics like how do you choose a project, era, which style, et cetera, are you drawn to? And I thought I could weave that into the issue of novel versus historical detail and research. What I look for in any historical novel is what I look for in any novel. Strong sense of place, of story, of characters I care about, of a worldview that throws light on my world, both emotionally and intellectually. What I don't look for is what we used to call back many generations ago, perhaps, or decades ago, I should say, dumping the index card. I don't know if anyone uses index cards anymore, into the narrative. You can just see the index card put in, akin to blending ingredients properly, not blending ingredients properly while cooking. What people wore 100 years ago, what they ate, is only interesting to me if the novel is interesting. I look for a narrative in which I really feel the authors feel for the period. Editors and readers can sense when the details feel lived in rather than delivered with a layer of dust that comes from dusty tomes. I worked recently on a member of Historical Knowledge Society, Lucy Hedricks, who's just published with Lake Union 6 Weeks in Reno. It's based on Lucy's grandmother, who went to Reno in 1931 to get a divorce. I was immediately interested in working on it through an agent because my grandmother went to Reno to get a divorce about 20 years after Lucy's did, and I was always fascinated by it as a young girl. I could immediately tell that Lucy had a feel for the early 1930s. She immediately captured a sense of what it would be like for a closeted mother and wife to leave suburban New Jersey and travel across an unknown country. In my in-house career as an editor, I edited Brett Lott's Oprah Book Club pick, Jewel. Again, grandmothers feature prominently. Brett's grandmother was an inspiration for the novel. Jewel, the protagonist, is blessed with 5 healthy children. She's poor, living in Mississippi in the early 1940s. She gives birth to her 6th child, who she assumes will be healthy and will be her last child. The novel is about how baby, Brenda Kay, turns out to be what was then called a Mongolian idiot, now I think Down syndrome. Brenda Kay, the baby, is both Jewel's burden and God's way of smiling on this mother, a poor Southern woman who has a personal duel with God. Brett Lott could not have written this book without his own strong sense of religiosity and his ardent humanity. I felt the same about Lillian That Tells the River Midnight, which I edited at Scribner, a stunning evocation of the richness of Jewish life in a shtetl at the turn of the century in Poland. The author's embrace of Jewish history and rituals, her celebration of feminist history, started way before she set out to write. That was just very clear. Way before she set out to write what one reviewer called Fiddler on the Roof without the music. I'm always looking for an intuitive and deeply felt connection between the author and the time period, the milieu that is brought to life. It's often a deep family connections I've just mentioned, or it could come out of a deep love of history and great intellectual curiosity. I spoke to celebrated historian and historical novelist Kevin Baker last night. As a historian, he has been led into fiction by the stories that history lends us. His novel Dreamland, reviewed on the front page of the Times Book Review, was inspired by Rick Burns' documentary about the world's first amusement park, the bizarre and rich world of Coney Island. Kevin was hooked by the documentary and was totally surprised that a novel had not been set in that world. Kevin described to me how well he remembers a child's book on the Civil War that his mother gave him when he was 5. His novel Paradise Alley, about New York City in 1863, during the time of the draft riots, was fueled in part by a detail he discovered while researching. The Tammany Hall government was so corrupt, the infrastructure so bad, that offals were clogging drains and blood was running out into the streets. Kevin saw a detail about little boys floating their toy boats on these rivers of blood. In short, deep engagement with material on all levels. It's great to read all the periodicals of the times, to travel as much as possible to the sites of the novels, to immerse yourself in the customs of that era. E.L. Doctorow said that the best historical novels require the least amount of research. Other novelists will say voluminous research is a must. But no matter which way you go, I would urge you to marry quality research with a well-told tale, one that transcends time, place, and culture.
Okay, thanks very much, Jane. I love all that detail for his projects. Okay, our final speaker, Leslie Wells, was an executive editor at Hyperion, Pocket, Simon & Schuster, and Dutton for over 25 years before becoming an independent editor. She has edited a number of works of historical fiction, including Stolen Beauty by Laurie Lico Albanese, The Physic Book of Deliverance Dane by Catherine Howe, Inside the Mirror by Parul Kapoor, Rebel Daughter by Laurie Kaufman, Sweet Smoke by David Fuller, The Ruins by Steve Wick, this is forthcoming this spring from Simon & Schuster, and Beyond the Buckabuck Tree by HNS NYC's own Loretta Goldberg. Leslie also edits mystery suspense, commercial fiction, and memoir. More information is on her website, www.lesliewellseditorial.com, and I will add that into the chat. Today, Leslie will talk about recent trends in historical fiction and how they may or may not affect the way you consider your next work. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you. So I had to do a little bit of research for my talk to look at trends. So I wanted to start just with a little bit about historical fiction. In an article in The Nation, Alexander Manshall pointed out that a historical novel has won the Pulitzer Prize in the last 12 out of 15 years. And historical fiction has made up almost 3/4 of all major American awards since the year 2000. In terms of why the genre is so popular, in Writer's Digest, Audrey Blake had some thoughts. She said that readers are drawn to historical fiction because they want to experience a past when things were simpler, quieter, more focused. Blake says historical fiction is an exercise in quiet and self-discovery and self-assessment. As we meet potential versions of ourselves in the past, we diagnose where we are at present. We sit quietly in the pages, learning how to navigate a time and place we will never visit. Well put, I thought. Anyway, so given the popularity of historical fiction, I think it's interesting to look at recent trends in the area. Certain periods in history have been covered quite a bit: Tudor England, the Civil War era. Others have not been written about as often. The Women by Kristen Hanna, I think, is an example of an interesting time period that hasn't been covered as much in historical fiction, and also a fascinating cast of characters. It's about nurses in Vietnam, and the main character is a nurse who then comes back to the States and experiences a lot of interesting reactions from the public to her having been a nurse. It's a wonderful book if you haven't dipped into it yet. So writing about eras that haven't been mined quite as often, or telling stories from the points of view of characters that we haven't yet seen, can really be a way to consider fresh topics for historical fiction. Then again, these things do tend to come in waves. I think the 70s are the new 60s in a sense, where films and books are looking back at that decade quite a bit. It can be helpful to think about trends that may spur ideas for your own next novel, or steer you away from material that you may feel is kind of overly familiar or has been covered a little too much. So for this discussion, I looked at 100 of the historical novels coming out this year. I said I did a little research to analyze some of these trends. I've organized this in chronological order in terms of time periods, and then I'm going to go into some specific categories of novels that are trending. So pardon me if I use some notes for this. Over 6 years ago, Circe by Madeline Miller kicked off a reawakened interest in Odyssean myth and mythology in general. This year, there are 5 major books in this vein. There are also 2 novels about Boudica, the warrior queen who spurred a revolt in Roman-occupied Britain, whom I had never heard of Boudica, actually, and there are 2 novels coming out about her. There are 2 novels about Cleopatra this year, indicating publishers' continuing interest in her. Jumping ahead in time, a book that looks incredible is Allegra Goodman's Isola, which was inspired by the real life of a 16th century woman. Heir to a fortune, Marguerite is orphaned and her guardian brings her on an expedition to New France where she's abandoned on a small island. So this is an interesting setting in early Canadian history that allows the author to create a fresh vision for her character and the time period. Goodman's book is generating a lot of early interest, and she's a terrific writer. There are new novels set in Tudor England and 2 Shakespeare-adjacent novels. Of course, last year we had Jodi Picoult's By Any Other Name about 2 women playwrights, one in 1581 and one in the present day. So the trend of historical fiction set in Shakespeare's time continues. Manette Walters, who's actually a favorite of mine, The Scold's Bridal was incredible, is coming out with a book called The Players about the bloody assizes after the end of the Civil War in England. 3 novels will take place in 17th and 18th century England, and then set in America in the 1880s is a new book by Isabel Allende called My Name is Amelia del Valle, a story about a woman who becomes the first American female news columnist. The novel plays into another trend that I'll talk about in a little bit, fiction that depicts women breaking barriers. Historical fiction. So 6 novels are forthcoming about the Civil War period. One I'll be excited to read is Happy Land by Dolan Perkins Valdez. I loved her novel Take My Hand, set in 1970s Alabama. It's about a Black nurse who's a whistleblower in a family planning clinic, and I recommend it to everyone. It's incredible. Her new book is about present day woman based on apparently on a family story, a present day protagonist who learns from her great grandmother about a community of freed people in the hills of North Carolina. So that's on my list to read. There are 3 new novels set in the American Wild West in the 19th century, and certainly in decades further back, I think there were a fair amount of Wild West kind of novels. That seems like a revived trend right now in historical fiction. This year, 3 novels take place in 19th century England, including Fagin the Thief by Alison Epstein, a reimagining of the world of Dickens from London's most gifted pickpocket. Several novels will focus on pre-civil rights America this year, including The Sable Cloak by Gail Melissa Grant. This novel is set in the Midwest in the 1940s, and it's a rarely seen portrait of an upper middle class African-American family in this time period. Another novel that looks intriguing is The English Problem by Bina Kamlani. I noticed Judy mentioned working with her, in which a young Indian man is chosen by Mahatma Gandhi to represent his country in England. So these books indicate publishers and readers' continued interest in mythology themes, Cleopatra, Shakespeare's period, Britain's distant past, the American Civil War, and a renewed interest in the American Wild West. In addition, readers remain compelled by stories set in World War II. 9 new novels this year will be set during the Second World War. That includes Pam Jenoff's Last Twilight in Paris. And many of you, as I did, may have read The Orphan's Tale about 2 women in a traveling circus in Western Europe. And I can't wait to read her new book. So World War II settings continue to be a strong trend. 3 novels about the 1950s and 60s are coming out, including one on Soviet ballerinas during the Cold War. Come Fly With Me is about 2 stewardesses in this early period of air travel. And another one that looks like fun is called American Housewife by Anita Abriel. It takes place in New York City in 1950. And radio personality Maggie Lane gets a big break with her own show in the exciting new world of TV. All she has to do is act like the ideal housewife, although she's never baked a cookie, so that sounds like a lot of fun. We've had some incredible novels, as I mentioned, about the 70s recently, The Women by Kristen Hanna. Of course, a few years ago, there was Daisy Jones and the Six, based on Fleetwood Mac. That was a great book. Bright Young Women by Jessica Knoll, a chilling novel about the Ted Bundy attack on young women in a sorority house in Florida. There was also Kent State by Deborah Wiles on the May 1970 shootings. So I really like reading about the 70s because, again, it hasn't been covered as much in historical fiction. In fact, it didn't technically become historical fiction until 2020, I guess, because that was 50 years ago. And it's so interesting to see these socio-political events through a new character's point of view. So fiction set in the 70s is definitely a continuing trend. Blending in historical fiction remains a strong interest. There are blends of fantasy and history and romance and history, are very popular. A favorite of mine is mysteries set in the past. I think those can be so much fun to read, and that kind of novel remains popular as well. Then there are upcoming books around disasters. We have 2 Titanic novels coming out and one about the Lusitania. Everyone will remember Room by Emma Donoghue, about a woman who's kidnapped and held captive with her young son. Well, now Donoghue has written a novel called The Paris Express. It's set in 1895 at a disaster at a train station, and it involves a train full of characters from all over the world, and that one looks quite interesting. 3 new novels will focus on books by beloved authors. 2 are Jane Austen-esque, continuing that trend. I think readers, including me, can't get enough of Jane Austen. And then there is a novel about Louisa May Alcott's sisters. There are no less than 6 forthcoming novels about librarians, book clubs, and book societies, and that book-loving theme is continuing. As I mentioned earlier, novels about women breaking barriers are trending. One such novel is The Eights by Joanna Miller, about the friendship of 4 of the first women to matriculate at Oxford after World War I. Books that imagine the lives of famous women are always popular. This year, there will be novels about Martha Washington, the First Lady, Lulu de la Falaise, the 70s fashion icon, photojournalist Dickie Chappelle, and heiresses Doris Duke and Barbara Hutton. That one is about their friendship, which looks kind of interesting. I saw that 6 historical novels this year will take place in Hollywood in years past. That seems like a revived trend that's interesting. And finally, there are 4 novels inspired by Broadway shows and films. The Girl from Greenwich Street by Lauren Willig is about Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr's investigation of young woman's murder in the city. Before Dorothy by Hazel Gaynor follows Emily Gale in Kansas 1932. Thank you, Wicked. Ace Marvel Spy by Jenna Walsh. The protagonist of that novel edits the Wonder Woman comics. And Let's Call Her Barbie by Renee Rosen is about Ruth Handler's vision for a doll that lets young women dream about any career they aspire to. So these are some categories of trends and upcoming books in this area. I recently read the fascinating novel Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon. I'm sure a lot of people have read that. So in her author's note, Lawhon said that the spark of the idea came when she was sitting in her doctor's office waiting for an appointment and thumbing through magazines. And she just happened to pick up a little pamphlet, and in it, there was a piece about a midwife in the late 1700s who had delivered over 1,000 live babies in her time, which in her time period was incredible, given the, the record for babies being born then. Many were stillborn, et cetera. So, Ariel tore out the page and wrote at the top, would make a great novel. And when she looked into the subject later, the only complete history of Ballard was a biography in the Midwife's Diary. So that torn out article while waiting in a doctor's office turned into an amazing story and novel. The reason I'm mentioning Lawhon's inspiration is that the best books, I feel, will always be based on subject matter that sparks your interest. When writers ask me what trends they should be following in terms of being published or getting representation, I always advise them to be aware of what's happening in fiction, but to follow their own heart. For one thing, what's trending now may kind of be over by the time your manuscript is ready to be submitted. And you'll always write your best work, of course, about what most interests you, whether it's a year in Henry VIII's court or 3 days at Woodstock. Even better, your novel could start a trend, your own trend in historical fiction, or it could revive an interest in a particular time period, as did novels such as Perfume by Patrick Susskind, The Story of Edgar Sawtelle by David Wroblewski, Cold Mountain by Charles Fraser, Wolf Hall by Hilary Mantel, or Circe by Madeline Miller. So it's good to be aware of these trends in historical fiction, but let your own imagination be your guide for your next amazing book. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, Leslie. I really appreciate all the detail and the research you've done. It's a great list. Okay, so now we'll open it up to audience Q&A in a few minutes, but just before, and feel free to, I see a lot of people have entered questions already. Feel free to add your questions. I just have a few questions I'd like actually to ask all three of you, kind of on the more on the practical side, I guess. And the first is, how do you choose a project? Are there things that you look for in terms of era, genre, style? Is there anyone who would like to go first?
Oh, I can go first if I can
Okay,
find my
great.
mute button there. It's funny, Sarah. Sort of along with what Jane was saying, and maybe Leslie a little bit too. My area of strength is literary fiction, but I also really enjoy, what is considered more commercial mainstream fiction now and then too. And there are certain things that I like. Like I really like mysteries, and I really like stories that have a bit of a supernatural thread. But I work in a really wide range, and the way it generally works for an independent editor like me is that I get queries from writers often because an agent has said, you need a little more work, check with Judy, see if you guys are a good fit. I read, 20 pages. I ask for just a little description of what's the whole story so I get a quick sense of the narrative arc. And then it's very instinctive. Am I feeling pulled into the story, and do I feel like I think I know how to guide this writer? And if I do, then I'm really happy to take it on. Sometimes something comes in and it's really well written, but it's just not my thing. It's just something I'm not really connecting with. And in that case, I reach out to people like Jane and Leslie and, the rest of 5e and even a wider group around us, because you get a sense over the years of who's really good at what kind of story, who's passionate about dogs, who's really interested in, books about Jewish culture or, different parts of the world, different things. So I guess that's my answer is it's so idiosyncratic. You just have to find the right match. The writer has to land with the right editors and the right agents who share their passion.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Is there anyone else who would like, Jane or Leslie, would you like to address that question?
Jane,
Right.
do you want to go?
Sure. I would just say, as I said, definitely, looking for work that, that pulls me in, that I believe in. And absolutely, when that very interesting list Leslie gave of, the range of historical novels, for whatever reason, and this is in my reading life, because I obviously, read a huge number of novels as well. I have never been drawn to antiquity or even, before, maybe even the 18th or 19th century. I can't tell you why, but it's just, for some reason, I just can't quite make the leap. And so I've, referred my colleague, some, terrific, novels set in yesteryears too far back for me to relate to my colleagues. So some of it is just, as Judy said, what you're interested in, where your sensibilities lie. But I have to feel that I have an intuitive sense of what the writer is trying to do, because I see my role as within that sort of, sense of having sort of a platonic ideal of what is, the author most trying to do, and help the writer get as close to that as he or she can. So,
I mean, do you feel that you need a background, a detailed background in the era that they're writing about?
no, but I do think, for instance, I mentioned The River Midnight by Lillian Nattell. I'm very interested in things Jewish, and I've edited a lot of both nonfiction and fiction on Jewish themes. And as soon as I saw that novel from The Agent, I knew that this was really fresh. So yes, to a certain extent, you want to bring to, I'm not a historian, I was an English major, but you do want to bring to the editing, you want to feel like you have a decent sense of the map and where on that map that this particular book falls.
Right.
So yes, I think you should have either real familiarity or just such a huge curiosity and intuitive interest that you can kind of make the leap.
I see. Okay,
Yeah.
great, thanks. And Leslie, did you want to?
Yes, thank you. Like Jane and Judy, I always ask to see a couple of chapters to get a sense of the writing, and also to feel how I'm responding to the protagonist. I really, when I read a novel or a historical novel, I kind of want to be the main character during that time. I want to occupy their consciousness. And I don't want there to be too much distance between myself and the character that I want to sort of live inside as I'm reading the novel or even editing the novel. So I really look for being drawn into the protagonist. I have kind of edited I've edited a novel set in 70 CE, and I've recently finished one about the Magellan's voyage, and I love Loretta's novel set in 1941 during the war in New Guinea, World War II. So I actually can become fascinated by a lot of different periods, as long as the writing draws me in and that main character, I want to sort of be possessed in a way by that main character.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Yeah, so the next question, really, for people in the audience who maybe they have a work in progress, maybe they're curious what your process is. If you could walk us through a specific project that you've worked on, I think, we'd love to hear about your process. Is there anyone who wants to address that?
Judy, do you want to, shall we go in order again? Judy?
Sure.
Okay, there. I was having a technical issue. Yes. I will say a couple of words about working with Mamta Chaudhry on Haunting Paris, which came to me, the book came out in 2019, so maybe she came to me in 2017, and I immediately fell in love with her writing and all these different elements of the story. It's about a musician named Sylvie who is living in Paris in 1989, and her lover Julien has recently died, leaving behind a letter that tells her that he was trying to find his family who was lost during the occupation of Paris in World War II. And Sylvie picks up the quest and she goes in search of the missing family, and she ultimately discovers a niece who survived. But at the same time, the story has many different story threads woven as a mosaic that are just the biggest love letter to Paris, and they toss you into a bunch of different time periods and then keep pulling you back to Sylvie's story. And there's also an important ghost in the story who observes Sylvie from above and sort of ties together all these different pieces of history. So you can see by the way I'm discussing it, it's not a straightforward historical novel. It's a historical novel with this sort of supernatural flavor to it. And when she brought it to me, she couldn't get an agent, even though her writing was so obviously really good and musical and special. And I worked with her on paring down, pulling out some of the extraneous subplots that were set in different time periods, and really making sure that the two main ones, the Sylvie mourning in 1989 and the World War II story, which is very suspenseful, really go back and forth. And then with a lighter touch, we made sure that these other stories were weaving through. And it was a real balancing act that we arrived at together. One or two other big things that I did to help her was, it's funny. I see that Gwen Florio is in this group. Hi, Gwen. Gwen wrote some fantastic mystery novels, and when we worked on the first one together, she had a great woman and her dog, and I love this dog so much. And I hope you don't mind, Mike, can I tell this? She was going to kill the dog at the end of the book. Like, the dog fell off a cliff, and I was like, no, you cannot kill the dog. So
absolutely, you saved me from myself. Thank you.
Okay, because that is so upsetting for dog lover people. It's much better to bump off a human than kill the dog. So what she ended up doing was having the dog get injured at the end, and then in subsequent episodes of the series, which starts with Montana, and it's Lola Wicks, right? That's her name.
Yeah.
Okay. It's a three-legged dog. She has a three-legged dog, and so it really added to the it added something wonderful to the series. All right, so that's my little detour.
Thank you.
With Mamta Chowdhury's book, she was ending the book with Sylvie discovering, what happened to the family, but they had all died. And I was like, wait a minute, I need hope. Couldn't somebody survive? Couldn't a niece survive? And we agreed that one of the, characters who was a child in World War II would survive, and that Sylvie and this character would, find each other by the end of the book. That was a big difference. It really pulled the story together and gave it a lot more, sort of happy resonance. It wasn't all, happy, but it was kind of a bittersweet, warm thing at the end. And the third thing is, when Mamta's agent sent the book out, um, there was a publisher, Nant Lease, at Doubleday, was extremely interested in the book, but she said there is something that's just not quite right yet. This ghost that Mamta had, she said she's not fully connecting to the Sylvie story. And I agreed. I saw she was right. So Mamta and I put our heads together, and we ended up realizing that um, the ghost could be Julien, the spirit of Julien. And once he had a much clearer identity, he was a spirit who could still see back through time, but he related a lot more directly with the present day story. So those are some of the things that Mamta and I worked together on to just tie up all the loose ends and make the mosaic sort of fall together and come into focus. Sarah, I hope that's clear enough.
Yeah, no, thanks. It sounds like a fascinating project, actually. Fascinating book. Okay, Jane? Oh, Jane, I think you're muted.
Good.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I thought as Judy's talking, I would talk about a slightly atypical story, but I think it's one that is instructive, which is a few years ago, I got through two different people, one a college classmate, one a first-rate agent, saying there's a manuscript by this guy named Peter Rose who has set a novel in Macau. We just mentioned New Guinea, but Macau during World War II. And this very, very good agent said the writing is great, absolutely terrific, but there's not really enough of a plot. It's just not focused enough, et cetera, et cetera. So I started working with Peter, and this was his first attempt at fiction. He's been a lifelong lawyer and person at Blackstone. And he and his family were in Hong Kong for 4 or 5 years for work. He fell in love with Macau, took many trips to Macau, and the description sounded so commercial because he basically said, Macau was the Casablanca of the Far East because it was neutral, a Portuguese colony, so the outmost sort of Western, outpost in the South China Sea, and it's about this British consul named Consul Reeves. So I'm thinking, oh my God, this sounds so commercial, So I started reading it. Great descriptions of the weather, great descriptions of food, the architecture. I mean, the guy is really a good writer, but it's like it wasn't really a love story. I thought it was going to be a thriller, which would have been very commercial. He's a really smart guy, and he's done great research. But it really wasn't. It wasn't a thriller. It wasn't a love story. It was this kind of odd, sort of sui generis narrative that wasn't really, to my mind, going to sell. So I kept, we worked together great. It was a treat to work with them. But I kept pushing him. We did several drafts. It got better and better. But ultimately, I began to sense that he didn't want to make the changes that would make it, either a really strong thriller and sort of the Daniel Silver. I mean, that can be a very, very strong category. Philip Kerr, Daniel Silver, these are writers that have done extremely well with historical, thrillers, smart novels. Wasn't interested in that, really didn't want to do the love story. Consul Reeves was like a weird guy. The author had gotten very interested in this guy's memoir, which he had published. Anyway, make a long story short, it became clear that he was not really interested in doing that, and he got a few really good agents to read it. They all said the same thing, and he decided to approach a nonfiction publisher in Hong Kong, an English publisher, who had never published fiction, but Peter really liked this guy's, list of nonfiction was excellent, very intelligent. And he wrote him, and the publisher in Hong Kong said, "I've never published fiction. I love this novel set in Macau." He published it. He did a great job. The book's looks really good. It's already in its second printing. It's been published in, it's been distributed in England and now here. And the author is just incredibly happy, and we made the book way stronger. But it was also a kind of, I think it's an instructive issue about when do you, how much do you push a writer to, in directions that ultimately is just, not what they want to do. So it was a very interesting and very rewarding project to work on. And when he wrote, the book was in the second printing, I was so happy for him.
Yeah, thanks. So that's a great story about, follow your heart.
Right, exactly.
Okay, Leslie?
Yes, one specific project I wanted to talk about was a novel called Inside the Mirror by Parul Kapoor. It was her first novel. Parul had sent me some chapters and a synopsis. It was a fascinating, to me, story. It was set in 1950s Bombay about twin sisters who wanted to be artists, whose parents wanted them to have more traditional careers. And I'd never worked on something set in Bombay, and definitely not in 1950. So I felt like I would learn about the period. Gorgeous, gorgeous writing. But along with editing the book, there was, she told me, sort of one mandate, and that was she did have a publisher quite interested, but at that time the manuscript was over 190,000 words, and they would not publish the book unless it was a maximum of 128,000 words. So we decided to work together, and I did have my work cut out for me. But because it's harder to cut books where the writing and everything is so good, that's more difficult. That's more of a challenge. Anyway, but I did, regular editing, and then also I did go over and over and over, to look for characters, subplots that could be trimmed, anything that was a bit extraneous to the main storyline. I'm happy to say we did get it down to 128K words, and the publisher accepted it. And I felt that with everything sort of pruned away, there was still quite a length, a good length historical novel. Then the story of the sisters and their artistic process and their growth as young women growing into older, more mature women, really kind of shone through. And I'm happy to say the novel got really terrific reviews. Publishers Weekly called it stunning. And it won a number of awards. It was a finalist for the Forward Indies Book of the Year, longlisted for Center for Fiction First Novel Prize, and the New American Voices Award, and a Ms. Magazine Most Anticipated Book of 2024. So I think that's inspiring too. This was a debut novel, as I'm sure many of you are working on possibly your first novels. And I know Parul felt like she was far, far away from getting published, much less winning awards and being shortlisted for these major things. But, hard work and a focus, I think, can really bring your first novel or any novel forward in a way that you may not have imagined. So that was a really, really rewarding project to work on.
Okay, great. Okay, thanks. It's very interesting. So now I'd like to kind of move on to audience questions. And I think I'll just, we have a number of questions. I think I'll just take them in the order in which they were entered. Now, the first, we may have addressed this somewhat, but if there's any, more comment on it. The question is, it's from Lauren. Do you guys think the 20th century trend will continue for several more years? Do you think there's a chance that trend might change soon? And then there's a follow-up from Gwen. Following up on that question, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the 20th century trend. I think Leslie, you addressed that somewhat, but if we have any other comments on.
Do you mean the 20th century trend of historical? I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think the trend in historical fiction set in the 20th century is what the question is asking.
As opposed to going much further back.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think Leslie addressed that. Do you have anything further to add about that?
I think it will continue because I do think that as authors re-envision all these decades that are, further back or decades away, I think that we learn more. And, I think people do have an interest in reliving whatever they may have lived or their parents may have lived and learning new ways to look at some of those decades. I think that it will
Definitely.
probably continue.
Definitely.
Okay.
I think it's also so broad, if it were, how many books can you have about the Manson murders, or how many books can you have about, um, when the stock market crashed, in the Depression. If it's that targeted and there are one or two really great books that have come out recently, that could make it harder for you to be placing your book there. But I think if you're looking at an overall time period, if the book is really good and strong and it is set in a particular time and place, I don't think that's any impediment. I mean, I'm thinking, that I remember when I was at acquiring at Random House, there would be types of books like there are a lot of historical novels set during World War II. And there's a reason. It's because people are so fascinated with that time period. So it means if you're writing a book set during World War II, the bar is really high to be one of the best books that are coming in about that period. On the other hand, if you're writing about something that nobody else has written about yet, it can be hard to get traction because, the editors are like, I don't know if people are going to be interested in a book set in this unusual part of the world, and time and place. So I think the most important thing is to write the best book you can and then work on getting support for that book, from an inner circle that will, help you fight to get it out there.
And also, if you come across, I mean, I loved Orphan Train. I thought that was a wonderful novel, and I didn't know about kids being sent out into the American, Midwest. I didn't know about that, and I found it, absolutely fascinating. So if you find, as you say, a moment in history that, it just seems intrinsically really interesting, and not a lot of people know about, that's golden.
Okay. Okay, so here's a question that's actually a kind of follows up on that. From Swapna. I write historical fiction set in colonial India, and I'm finding it hard to get traction with agents. Any ideas that help with this would be appreciated. Does anyone have thoughts about how to approach agents with that kind of
having difficulty getting representation? I think, I wouldn't say immediately that it's the time and the setting. There may be, an issue with, the way the protagonist or the, maybe the way the book is written or the way the pacing flows. I wouldn't necessarily, immediately pinpoint, well, it's the time and place that's causing the novel to maybe not get traction. It could be, but you might maybe look at other, getting some beta reads. You may have already done that, but just getting a sense of, is there something here that I'm missing that maybe not quite be working as well as it could.
Okay.
I don't know anything about the book, but is the author, I'm not sure if I see the person on the screen, and I don't think so, but is there a feeling that agents might, these days with politics and so forth and sensitivities, and is there some sense that writing about colonial India, I don't know at what point the novel takes place, what era, but is there something about writing about colonial India that can ruffle certain political feathers? Or I'm making this up, I don't know.
I'm just sure that the writing's not any good.
Okay. Well, yeah. So there, in other words, there could be a number of factors that. Okay. So now this is a question from Andy. How many feminist Civil War thrillers set in England exist? Enough to not even get a read for a mature, professionally edited draft?
I'm sorry, what was that question again?
I think the question is, how many feminist Civil War thrillers exist that are set in England? And are there enough that it would make it difficult to get even a read for a mature, professionally edited draft? So I think the question is there something about that subject matter that maybe there are many novels in competition with this?
You mean?
I mean, I'm not aware of a lot of novels
Yeah.
in that area.
No.
How about you guys?
No. And I'm assuming you mean the English Civil War.
No, this is the American Civil War, and there was a
Oh.
lot of intrigue that took place over there. And my protagonist is involved in this intrigue and finding her agency as a woman there. So, and my beta readers love it. I can't get a full read from anybody. And it's been edited, and I work with the late Janet Reed on preparing my query. So, you know, frustrating.
That sounds frustrating. When I'm working with a writer who has a specific thing like that, maybe this is bad to admit, but I kind of have the writer, I mean, I throw in anything I can and I will spend a few minutes looking into something. But if you're trying to figure out, are there other books that it's competing with so it feels like it's a tired field, is there a way that you can be researching that? Because it's so specific, I'm not sure we offhand would know the answer to it. But it could be useful information to know, and are there one or two that have some overlap that are working really well, where in your query you can be mentioning, hey, this worked really well and mine is kind of like that, but it's different in this way. And it might be a similar thing, Andy, that if you're not getting full reads, it may be that there's something not quite right yet. You've got a bunch of things working really well, but one or two things are not quite there yet, And any editor, when I work on a book, it's not going to turn out perfect at the end. We're going to make stuff a lot better, but there's only so much that a writer can do in one round. So sometimes it means maybe you have another revision ahead of you because a lot of stuff got improved, but there's still something that's not quite in focus yet.
I keep working on it. We're in draft 8 right now, and
Yeah,
my beta readers love it. They say it's like falling off a cliff.
Mm-hmm.
Have you tried to go to any kind of writers' conferences or pitch conferences where agents and editors in New York come to sort of look for, because that can be a helpful way to sort of bypass some gatekeeping.
Yes. And I can personally present to anybody, but it's still getting the full read. I mean, I'm getting entry, but I'm not getting the full read.
How long is the whole book?
It's 77,000 words.
70,000?
77,000.
Sure.
77? Okay, that's a perfectly reasonable length. Well, it's a mystery. I mean, there are some excellent beta readers, but beta readers are not always as astute as an agent, a professional independent editor, a really good teacher in a class. It may be that you need another ideal reader who is going to be more of a professional ideal reader, because your beta readers might be missing something that still needs an adjustment.
Well, thank you.
Okay, so let's move on. So the next question, how helpful are current trends with 2-year average publishing horizons? In other words, is it changing so quickly that it's hard to really use trends to project where things are going to be when your book is actually ready to go?
I think it is hard to use trends to project. And that's why I was saying, I think, it's good to be kind of aware of what's out there, definitely know what books are kind of coming out in your area, just so you have a working knowledge of it. But I still think, writing from the heart, what sparks your interest, I mean, just to go back to the Ariel Lawhon example, I'm sure she wasn't really planning to write a book about a midwife in the late 1700s, but something sparked her imagination about that little article about the real midwife who had lived during that time, and it became an incredible story. And I think that's the way a lot of great novels are generated. Just something sparks the imagination of the author. And the author may well be aware of trends, but then they're using their inspiration to really fuel writing, a really amazing book.
Okay, so actually the next question, Leslie, is for you also. What criteria were you using for your list? This is Martha's asking this. She says, it sounds like these were all major publishers, which does limit somewhat the trends many readers and independent authors follow.
No, actually, I just I looked at a whole bunch of lists online of books that are forthcoming this year, but it was from a range of houses. I mean, a number were from sort of more major houses, but some were from smaller presses or independent presses. I didn't have access to, for instance, like a list of self-published fiction that was coming out this year. So that I just, there was nowhere that amalgamated that. But I did combine a whole bunch of different lists and compare and contrast, which was fun and interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It sounded like a very thorough, pretty thorough list. The next question, are you ladies open to submissions? What is that process if somebody wants to submit to the 5E collective?
We are open to submission. We love hearing from writers. Somewhere in the chat, I put our website, 5eeditors.com, and you can query us individually. Like you'll see the grid of our pictures, those of us who are talking today, and also 3 other really wonderful editors. Yeah, we love hearing from you. And if you say, hey, would you like to work with me? We'll probably ask to see some material and let's see if we're a good fit. And if we're not, we may have a good idea of another editor who might be a better fit.
Okay. Okay, let's see. Okay, the next question, how does a writer begin to budget working with someone from your group?
I would say, find out the editorial fee for, I think most of us in the group there's a read and review, which is a very detailed, very close read of the manuscript, and we do a very detailed editorial memo. At least that's to me what a read and review is, and I think probably other editors in our group, similar thing. And that fee is typically less than a full edit, which is when we go through page by page and really edit, every page of the manuscript. That's more, and it depends on word count, how long the manuscript is, and how many hours we spend working on a project and all of that. But we're very open about, we wouldn't start working on a project unless the fee was very clear what the author should expect to pay for the service. So, that would be an individual discussion, like I said, based on the length of the manuscript, how many hours we'd wind up working in which particular service would be done, but they wouldn't be in the dark about that going in.
I see. Okay, I think that's it in terms of audience questions. We have a bit more time. If you're interested, I have a few more questions if you'd like to. So my question is, what is the best stage to begin developmental editing of historical fiction? I mean, for example, how early in the process would it, generally be helpful?
Myself. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. I would say that, in this sense, historical fiction is no different than I edit a lot of memoir too, and, non-historical fiction. And I would say that this question is more about, at what point is the writer sensing that they are really ready to have, one of us or other independent editors really approach and engage with the material.
Mhm.
And so if you have 100 pages that you're feeling really good about, but you're wondering, you've sort of reached a crossroads about, am I taking this in the right direction? I'm a little nervous about this and that. The other thing, if you think the 100 pages are strong enough to get a read, that can be actually very helpful, because it can sort of help you maybe not go down the wrong path if it works out that way. So I would say that you can be creative about that. But I think it really depends, what you're looking for. I would say generally for me, and I think Leslie and Judy probably say the same thing, is that, usually with fiction, I look at a full draft. But as I said, if you're feeling it would be helpful to look earlier, that can be fine too. And of course, less expensive, because length is your enemy in terms of the fee, because obviously the longer the manuscript, the longer it takes to edit.
I want to say that Jane, you're generally right that fits me too. Although I do sometimes look at somewhere between 50 and 100 pages of the opening section of the book plus a synopsis. If the writer's really struggling with how am I going to shape my story, I could take it this way, I could take it that way, or I'm just stuck. I sometimes come in early just because story consultation is one of my specialties because of my background in improv. So I do sometimes look at things pretty early. And also, I think often the first time I work with someone, it's easier to see the full manuscript. But I have some writers that I work with on book to book. And for them, if they're starting their next book, sometimes they go, I've got the first 30 pages. And, I think once we're already working with someone, there's even a wider range of different ways to work together, some of which are, can you give me 4 hours of your time to look at this opening thing and tell me if it's feeling promising?
I see. Yeah. Do you work closely with authors on revisions? I mean, how does that whole process go? Or do you mainly point to problems in the draft and let the author find the solution? Or does that vary from project to project?
You want to jump in, Leslie?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it actually does vary from project to project. Some people at the outset know that they want a read and review, sort of a larger kind of focus, because they sense that their novel has some larger issues that they're struggling with. So first we start with that, and then they know that then they want me to come back and do the full edit, the page by page edit. So that's one way to go. And some people want, after I've done that kind of memo or read and review, some people say, can I send you, can I revise these 50 pages and send them to you? So it just really kind of depends on the individual project and what the author is looking for in terms of feedback. But Jane and Judy, you guys probably have something.
Well, I always look at it that I feel it's my job to help the writer, and this is whether it comes to me through an agent or a writer directly referred by other writers I published in-house or have worked with since becoming independent editor. I see my job as trying to help the writer get the material to the point where it's ready to be taken on by an agent and then hopefully a publisher. So I don't, in general, I'm not a fan of working on repeated drafts unless I really feel there's an awfully good reason to do it. And of course, it also can depend on, some authors have very large budgets and other authors, have small budgets. So but I'm very mindful that, I usually, the kind of developmental editing I think that's the most effective is really eliminating the kinds of roadblocks that keep people from wanting to finish the novel and love the novel. So, I'm not messing with a lot of grammar issues. You all write you all know grammar. I mean, those things do not keep a book from getting sold and working. So I really look at it as strategic editing, really getting it to the point where, it's really ready to be shown. And often that's one draft, often it's two is pretty common, but beyond that, it would be the rare book that I do 3 and 4 edits on.
Mhm.
When I was in-house, I did, lots of, that was a different story. But, the author was already under contract. They were getting money. I was being paid the publisher.
Same here. I would say after two really thorough edits, I usually feel that I'm not giving the book a really fresh read. Again, and if the author really wants another read after that, I'll often suggest one of my friends and colleagues in 5e at that point. Yeah.
I guess also I was wondering, I mean, if there's some aspect of the book that's really not working, maybe something about the point of view, maybe something about a specific character in a specific section of the book, and it's just not working for you. I mean, how specific are the suggestions that you give, or do you essentially say, look, I think there's a problem here, and then leave the author to figure out how to kind of recast that?
Oh, no. The suggestions are definitely hands-on. I mean, definitely.
Okay,
All the issues of craft are absolutely crucial.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
I find that if there is some element that's been extremely difficult to capture, I could look more specifically at, a particular section, a particular chapter. I might go beyond 2 rounds, I sometimes do, to look at a more targeted aspect of the book. And it's just sort of a small assignment to really try to get something right. And I'll also say that now and then I work with a writer who needs to be line edited in order for the really strong writing to come out. And sometimes I'm working with a writer where I feel like I can really channel them. And part of what I do is I do a chunk of line editing and say, I could do this through the whole book, or you could look at what I did and apply it to the rest of the book. There's a lot of very detailed, very specific back and forth between, editor and writer that is different with every single project, depending on what the writer needs. They're going to be really good at some things and need some shoring up in other ways.
Yeah, I agree with Jane and Judy in terms of being very specific about the suggestions. I mean, I think vagueness is just not helpful. So if there's a larger issue, I'll suggest several, probably a couple of ideas. You could do this. I'm just working on a novel today that has pacing issues. And I was just saying, well, you could go this way with these characters, and telling them at what point to, sort of add potential new scenes, or they can take that advice and sort of turn it into something else that will help the pacing in the novel. But yeah, very, very specific.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks. So I think I just have, we have time really for one more question. Do you sometimes send authors back to do more research? Is that sometimes an issue that you feel needs to be addressed with historical fiction?
So I'm going to say that we all three started talking at once. I'm going to say that I sometimes do, because if I'm, the quote unquote ideal reader, I'm the general reader getting this delicious early look at a book. If I have questions about why did that gun really exist in that time period, or is this really a custom back at that time period, I'm querying those things, and that will lead to the writer going back to shore up their position. Either they've done the research or they haven't done enough yet. If they've done the research, they haven't figured out a way to get it into the manuscript. But I do query those things. Anything that bumps for me as the early reader, I bring up, and that sometimes leads to research that the author has to go back and do.
Okay.
Jane, do you want to go and then I'll go?
Yeah, no, I mean, again, that notion of being, that you want the fiction to feel lived in. So if I'm editing and I feel like it's a little vague, I will say, I'm not quite understanding this. And so, so if I'm a little befuddled, then it's a chance for the author to, sharpen. And if that means more research, that's great. Often I think it means just digging deeper into the motivations and the characters and, all those issues.
I mean, sometimes when I read a book, a scene is kind of skimmed over or suggested, but sometimes the scene, it looks as if the scene could be really interesting and important actually to the plot or the character development. If it's Queen Catherine's court in Chenonceau, and it's briefly mentioned that there was a feast, I may say, well, who was there and what foods were served and what, minstrels were playing and how was the light streaming in through the windows and what wood smoke were you smelling when you walked in there? So yeah, that kind of thing would require more research. Also with historical fiction, I do keep and I'm sure we all do, we keep an eye out for anachronisms because that can really be a killer. You don't want to see a laptop in the late 80s.
No,
You don't want to see, a lute when lutes weren't invented yet. So I think we probably all do a bit of fact checking. If something strikes me as a little off about a date or any detail, then I'll just kind of look it up and make sure it's right for the time period. Yeah.
Okay. So actually one last question came in. How do you remember from version to version? Typically, how long is it between the time you see version 1, version 2? Is that ever an issue?
I don't like to see them too close together because that can be confusing. And so, I always say, I think Judy said this: you can only have a fresh reaction so many times. But between the first draft and the second, if it's a full edit, I would be unhappy if I were asked to look at it, in even within 2 months or less, or even 4 to 6 months seems really good. If it's a major revision, it should take time. And I say to the author, let the muse work. It's great you're eager, but don't rush it.
Okay, so you would prefer really to see something where it seems fresh to you.
Definitely.
And
really
you might remember
in a major
much.
way. Yeah, really.
Got it.
On all the issues that we talked about that need work. Yeah.
Sure. Okay, any final comments? Anyone else have?
No, except thank you so much for having us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for a fantastic discussion, and thank you for sharing your expertise. It's really great to hear from you
very much.
Thank you. We enjoyed being here.
That concludes our program. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something new. You can find out more about the New York City chapter of the Historical Novel Society at our website or contact us at info@hnsnyc.org. And finally, please consider supporting our volunteer panelists and hosts. You can contact them at their websites in the description. Thanks for joining us.